Hello, everyone. Welcome back. My name is Josh Weinberg, also known as Master Pug in a lot of different places online. Today I'm going to show you all a drawing that I started from scratch. It's that piece that I've got up right there. I'll be honest with you, I had a super rough day drawing. I did end up with this piece, which I'm pretty happy with. It's not perfect, but I do like it. Even if you're having a rough day drawing, I think I did 3 or 4 drawings before this one, and they were all terrible, and I deleted every single one of them. So, don't get down on yourself, just kind of keep at it. I will say the other pieces I was doing first was they were all real character centric, sort of character design pieces, and so I finally was so frustrated I ran off and was like, nope, we're just gonna do a piece that's an environment or like a full illustration. So I did want to do something that was a little bit more chiaroscuro, a little bit heavy on the black, very gloomy. And this is a style that I think was, in comics at least, was made really popular by Mike Mignola, as the guy behind Hellboy. And I didn't want to spend too much time really detailing or making interesting characters. Like I said, I had a lot of hard time with characters before I even drew this. And so instead, I wanted to focus more on the environment and really kind of bringing that sense of gloom or dread forward. Still pretty much in the fantasy vein, but wanted to kind of get an idea. So I'll talk a little bit about what you're seeing. So this is just me sort of noodling out where I think things will be in the frame. When you're taking when you have an image, you're sort of doing a still shot of whatever's going on, and so you got to try to piece together, what people are seeing or what is interesting. And in this case, I decided to have my little intrepid adventurer who's there in the middle, and the camera or the eye, the viewer, wherever this is being drawn from, is essentially right behind him, and there's this giant creepy lich thing sort of up in the corner there. Or sorry, not up in the corner, up in the center. Sorry, I was drawing in the corner. And I wanted to sort of have this imposing figure pointing down at him. I'm not sure if that arm actually came off in the final as pointing, but that was kind of the goals. It's sort of like being in a tomb is what I had as sort of the idea. Now, if you use this kind of technique or you're familiar with Mignola's work, uh, you have to add a lot of. It requires some real stark contrasts are what you're looking for. So really heavy on the lights versus the darks. Large areas of black that are punctuated by little bits where the light is bouncing off of something. So that pile of skulls I have kind of over on the side noodled in, that becomes really important. And this is where I discovered that, or decided that top bit of the picture was really just hurting it. Um, I kind of liked the verticality of just having those doors, or I guess originally they were going to be doors. I think they turned out to just be walls. Maybe it's an arch or something. But having that block at the top, it would have just been black space, and so I just removed it. And so here I'm actually working on adding in some light sources, getting a better idea with drawing an environment. You do really need to kind of figure out where your light's going to come from, and in a tomb, you have to figure out exactly where it's coming from. So in this case, I wanted to have some torches so that I could have some light showing, the fog or whatever that is. I think it definitely it ends up being fog, or poison cloud or whatever. And so here again, I'm adding like what looks like it's going to be a candle sconce. But I decided ultimately that was not good. I used those little mushrooms growing on the giant skull over there in the corner as a light source, and then that's me marking to track where those are going to be. X's like that, Xing out a section in sort of the comic world, at least as far as I know it, that usually just signifies, hey, this is going to be a black area. So, you don't really have to worry too much about it. But this is definitely an underdrawing, so the goal here is to just sort of figure out where everything's going to go, find general empty spaces, and then clean it up later. Like you'll see I detailed out some of the tomb stuff, like the goblet sort of wall drawing over there on the left-hand side, and the little knife. And I knew at that point, well, what I'm going to do is draw it once, and then sort of copy paste it onto the other side. So you can make those decisions early on, I think, is a good idea, because it's going to save your brain some space, to not have to draw it all once and then draw it all again, especially if you're working digital. If I was not working digital, and was doing it manual, I will actually say that, redrawing something like that is a little bit easier, I feel, manually than having to do it digital. Something about how the digital media works, and I think it's just, since you're drawing on a screen, even the best screens still don't really feel like paper or anything like that, so it becomes a little bit harder. I think if I were to do this manually, I would have used a ruler to mark off where all of those things are. This is all pretty much freehand. I do use the selection tool to generate some of the lines. I'll talk a little bit more about that when I really get there. Now, here I am filling in the black spaces, and I would actually say that you don't always have to do this in an underdrawing, especially if you're really used to how it's going to look. I found it helpful in this case because I really wanted to get an idea: do I have too much light? Do I have too little light? Where am I thinking the black space is going to go? Is that actually going to look correctly? Because at this point, I'm having to, in my mind, think about where all the blacks are going to go, where all the heavy ink stuff's going to go. And this actually helped me spot, so that I added a little torch kind of to the foreground, next to that shield that's lying next to the skulls, because it just having to do all of that in your head becomes really cumbersome, and it can keep you from making more decisions and better decisions, because you have to keep rethinking, and then you'll waste time because you'll add something that's just super not good. But your brain at the time thought it was, because it was busy trying to calculate, oh, the shadow should be here, and not really thinking, oh, this is just not a good idea. You just shouldn't add this new thing that you're trying to throw in there. So I haven't talked a lot about shape language in this. I wanted to have it. Shape language is an interesting thing, and it gets talked about a lot by character designers. We watch their videos. Feng Zhu, if you've ever seen the FCD school stuff, and if you haven't and you're really into concept art, I would highly recommend going and watching those. They're pretty advanced, but you can still learn some lessons, just general lessons about design. But with sort of having a menacing situation, pretty sure this adventurer, if that is really a lich, he's not going to survive this. But you want shapes to be pointy or off. Like, I wanted, especially if you're trying to mimic a style like Mike Mignola, you want things to feel uncomfortable. And you do that by trying to have lots of hard edges, lots of points. Even if you look at the plants, they don't grow like a plant normally would grow. They have this sort of, creepy, edgy spiral sort of deal going on with them, and that just gives it a little bit more danger. People usually interpret sharp corners dangerous, and also sort of patterns that don't really fit. So you notice that, like, the plant, for a good example to use it again, it does have this sort of like edge spiral thing going on, but it doesn't really carry over to the entire plant. Parts of it don't do that. And it kind of makes it feel off. And that was kind of the goal, is to make it feel a little discombobulated. And so now I've kind of gone away. I'm done with the underdrawing. And in this case, I actually tried to keep the silhouette of the warrior pretty much the same. I didn't want to do a lot of detail. He's not really the focus of this piece, the hero. The focus is more the sort of ghastly creature in the fog and just sort of the environment itself. And I didn't want him stealing the show. So yeah, here I'm just noodling in the sort of the skull and things like that. This one does end up being sort of the final line work version of this. this layer. I didn't go in and put in 1,000 other layers. I I know a lot of artists work strictly in one. I don't always. In fact, even in this one, I'm pretty sure I put in some other layers so that I can add stuff without, risk damaging the underlayer. It's not fun to do Control Z 1,000 times when you screw up. But you'll see it when they pop up. I do have some other layers, and I can kind of talk about those over on the side while this is going on. I'm just kind of detailing out some of the stuff that I had. Yeah, that top layer, or some of this is an artifact from other drawings. I kind of have like 2 or 3 files that just have some real basic elements in them, and then I just alter them as I go. So I essentially have a base file that's just different backgrounds. So one is that paper background, like I did for the other video. And then, if I want a different color, like for this one, I just threw down white on top of it. Over on the top there, that's my working, at the very top is a text layer, I believe, which some of these drawings for in my template, I do text, I do handwriting when I'm creating like journal entries and stuff. And then below that is Clip Studio has layers that allow lines to strictly conform. They basically set up a ruler. And so that's one of those layers. It's used to generate some of the lines for my journal entries, but I'm not using those in this one. I just wanted it blank, so I have it turned off. And then the next layer under that is obviously that's the layer I'm drawing on now. You can see that's highlighted in blue, so it's selected. Below that is the underdrawing, and then below that is white. And then Clip Studio does require you to have a quote-unquote paper layer. It's the bottom layer. It's locked. It's always on. The solution for me is just, put a layer on top of it and, put a color in there. So that one is on, but really right now I'm just working off the 3. I've got the white background, I've got my underdrawing, and then I have my actual drawing. The one that I'm actually doing sort of my final work on. So I've detailed in that skull over there on the left. It's meant to be a skull. I don't know if everybody's going to see it. Some sort of giant beast that died down here. And then this one is a pile of skulls, and you'll notice if you can see sort of near the torch, not all of the lines connect, and that was intentional. The idea is that any color that I throw in there, and when you're doing color, you do have to kind of think about how that's going to play, especially with these kind of pieces like into the shadows and things. And the idea is that the torchlight is so bright that when it hits the skulls, and bone is kind of a reflective surface, that it's going to bounce around and create, in some areas, place where there just isn't black. There's no real dark black in there. Black and lines really signify deep shadow, or like a crease or a place where light can't penetrate. And so if I put too many lines in there, it starts making it look really, really dark, which wouldn't make sense because the skulls are sitting right next to a torch. You have to be a little careful with that when you're doing this kind of drawing. I also say that, by not having those lines there and kind of making the skulls merge a little bit towards the light, it makes it seem like there's so many more of them. That's also kind of the cheat for skull piles and things like that, which I will say I was actually pretty happy with how the skull pile turned out in this one. But the cheat for doing piles of things, of refuse, or really anything else is that you don't have to draw all of them. In fact, it's almost the same way with hair. You shouldn't draw every hair strand. You shouldn't draw every skull on a skull pile. What you need to do is have 1 or 2 in there that indicate that these are skulls. And then after that, anytime you sort of draw a circular shape with 2 dots for a nose, or 2 dots for a nose, 2 dots, 1 for each eye, 1 for the nose, to the viewer, it'll read as a skull. The human brain is so good at picking out faces and picking out things that look like faces, and really good at patterns and repetition, that as long as you have one of something that looks like what you want that pile to be or whatever, the brain will just sort of fill in the gaps and consider everything else in there to be that thing. So as you look, you'll notice that the shadow that I'd originally marked off for the bone pile is kind of pushed out a little bit. Because that skull pile is extending into the foreground, I had to think about really the three-dimensional shape of it and how the light's going to hit it. So the light's going to hit really close to wherever the torch is, right? And then the light will extend up the bone pile, but only so long as that sort of plane of light is hitting it. As soon as the bone pile sort of pushes back into the darkness, because, it would be a round pile. You can't have a square pile of bones unless you have something holding it together. But if it's just piled up on top of each other, because of that angle, you have to treat it kind of like a cone. And that is something I would definitely, if you're getting started in art, really start thinking about how the shapes work in three-dimensional space, even though you're drawing on something flat. I think that was the longest lesson it took me to learn, and painting actually really helped with that. I'm still not a great painter, but it even just painting every once in a while helps me really think about the shapes of things. Oh, I should mention that I was going to have some like eyes and stuff on the vines to make them even creepier. They didn't make it into the final. I felt like it was overkill and weird to the point of just it just didn't feel like it made sense. So yeah, I just erased it out and was like, nope, just not going to do eyes on these. But in terms of, yeah, again, if you're going to start working or you're having trouble progressing, you might take a look at sort of getting used to thinking about shapes, or even just drawing a whole bunch of the base shapes, spheres, boxes, cones, things like that, cylinders, of course, and drawing them from life. You can find everything is made up of real basic shapes, so you can sort of find objects that represent those things, put a light on them, and then see how the light kind of works with them. You do have to keep in mind, of course, whatever the thing is made out of is going to affect it. So, if you choose a tube of toothpaste for your sort of cylinder sort of object, just know that light's going to bounce off it because the outsides are plastic, so they're pretty reflective. And light doesn't reflect like that off of everything. So there's a lot to keep in mind, and I think it's really just a mode of just practice, get used to thinking about those kinds of things, and then when you actually get into doing more art, it will become easier because you'll remember, oh, this is basically a giant rectangle, so light's going to hit it like this. And you'll still have to think about it, but it'll be quick. Again, I'm mostly a hobbyist. Like I get commissions every once in a while. So, anything that I'm doing here is not above and beyond what anybody else can do. I just have been doing it for a while. So here I'm sort of figuring out that bone structure. It looked really, really wonky when I originally had it, so here I'm making it look much more spinal. And I liked it because it helps sort of keep the eye in. I did make one sort of large faux pas when I was building this out, and that it's not so hard to see right now if you're used to looking for it, but because I have those mushrooms where they are, and the little light source of the torch near the skulls, one side of the page is much lighter. It has a lot more light sources than the other. And so one side is just, it just doesn't feel as heavy. And so it does feel a little wonky. I tried to fix it, but I think I ultimately just didn't make it as great. There's another vine that comes in later that I don't think I did as well. You probably just saw my selection tool. I'll do it again, and I'll talk a little bit more about why I do it that way for straight lines rather than using the line tool. But so here, when it comes up, here noodling in this background guy, there's I don't know what this technique is called necessarily, but it's basically making up a shape or a silhouette of just really tight, scratchy little lines. I feel it works really well when characters are enshrouded in fog. It looks kind of like it. It allows the mind to try to pick out detail where maybe there isn't any. Because again, I wasn't doing this as a working character design. This was more about the environment, so I didn't want it to make it particularly interesting. Or well, not interesting. There's a double negative. I wanted to make it more about the place rather than the people in it, despite the fact that it is kind of a menacing situation. Yeah, so here I'm using the selection tool again. So the reason that I do it this way, and I think it was actually a video, I can't remember, I think it was from a BlizzCon or something, where one of the artists talked about, as sort of like a pro tip, to use the selection tool when you're trying to do straight lines and then draw straight down, or draw along the edge. And the reason that they do that is because it allows you to preserve the sort of just natural jitteriness of the hand to make it look more like a living line, rather than just kind of like a robot drawn or clearly straight line drawn line. Because you'll still have some of that edge that you give it, but it won't look mechanical to the naked eye. And so I've kind of stuck with that. I really actually do appreciate that technique. I think it looks really, really nice. And while I can sort of draw out, I mean, you saw in the rough drawing, I can kind of draw out a straight-ish line. I do appreciate, especially for something like this, having really rigid straight lines that are perfectly sort of up and down. I do have to, I have to obviously eyeball like some of the distance, the lateral distance, but yeah, for this I just drew those lines, flipped it over, and then sort of did the same thing just to make sure I had the same width. And so here I am sort of noodling in more of the black area, just so that I can kind of figure out. You'll notice that I sort of put an edge line there on the skulls, so maybe there's another light source over there, or it's just bounce light. The reason that I do that is because otherwise when you're trying to do a very black, heavy, dark, gloomy piece, you have to know that even if something's going to be completely in the dark, like completely, people are the eye's gonna kind of need to figure out where the back is of an object. Otherwise, you're gonna lose it, and by that I mean you won't be able to see it from the background, or the viewer won't. So. And also in the real world, there really isn't a perfect black. I mean, I know that there's an artist out there who made a very perfect black, but outside of that, in the natural world, perfect black isn't really a thing. So, and even in the super dark, people are still able to make out edges of shapes and things. So, because in this sort of media or this sort of version, I'm really working with perfect black. You still have to make some exceptions to make sure that people can actually see where the edge of that bone pile is, or where the guy's arm is. And so sometimes you have to create like a really thin gap of what's going to be color eventually, or light, just so that people can even tell what that thing is. Otherwise, it would look like that bone pile was like the highlight stopped for no reason, and it just kind of floods off the rest of the page. It would just be a giant black blot, and it creates interest. So yeah, here I am finally setting up that side. You'll notice that I've put in a couple of extra layers. This is mostly just so that I don't risk messing up, and also it helps when you're working really closely with other objects. Sometimes. Other things on the page, to have that extra layer of safety. The downside is, of course, that as you're erasing, you can get lost in your layers really easily. Like, oh, I didn't do this. This is on the wrong layer. This is on the wrong layer. No, 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 no. And so, I honestly am not a huge fan of having a ton of layers. I usually collapse down as quick as I can. I will say for this, when I did the color, because I was looking for a very specific sort of color profile, which is to say it's real specific light sources, really flat looking colors in a lot of ways, because I was really trying to kind of mimic that sort of Hellboy vibe. Because of that, I ended up using a ton of layers for color, which was annoying. But I think the end result turned out pretty well. I think if I had to do it again, I probably would have done some of the colors in a different order. But yeah, so here I'm actually figuring out and throwing in the more appropriate shadows for where the lights are. Um, if a light is low, it's going to create sort of an upward shadow. And I think that for me, what was really helpful whenever I do one of these pieces is to really think about light as real liquid, and really a less light liquid, but the shadow is liquid. It's very inky. It sticks to things. It clings. It seeps. And sort of having that mindset really helped. It really helps sort of figure out where things go, because it can make them feel real sticky. If you sort of treat them more like this sort of God, it sounds weird to say it, but this oily substance that's just trying to get through your art. And if you start kind of thinking about that way, you end up with a lot more blacks, and they end up clinging to everything, and it looks very gloomy. So that was kind of the idea. You also see all these like little lines I do on stonework and things, and that's mostly just because I want it to read as stone and not just a flat plane and provide some interest. I haven't talked too much about it just because it's really a small sort of just like it's a detail, but a lot of those things are sure they're interesting, but really all they're there for is so that when somebody looks at it, they can say, "Oh, that's stone," and not, "Oh, that's wood," because I want it to look like a tomb of some kind. So, and now I'm starting to put in the smoke. With Magnola's stuff, a lot of the lines are very simple, and I don't mean that his art is simple. I just mean that the lines are not complex. There's not a lot of sort of oddity to the shape. Like the shapes, if you look at them, are pretty simply drawn. But there's a lot of complexity layered on top of them because there are so many simple shapes, and there's just so much going on with them. Again, if you haven't looked at his work, I would really recommend just looking up some of like the Hellboy covers and things like that. They're absolutely fantastic. And he has a really great eye for just sort of it's a more graphic designy style than if you were looking at like Frank Miller stuff or Todd McFarlane, who does a lot of line work. I also really love Todd McFarlane stuff. So yeah, here I am sort of working on the background. That skull actually ended up back there because I needed something to sort of stop the giant hallway that was evolving, or cave structure that was evolving. So I wanted to put something in, maybe in the Lich's lair. He sort of has a ritual space with only one of the eyes lit up because that's creepier, instead of having a fire in both of them. Also gave a nice little light source for the back end of the cave. I think realistically it wouldn't illuminate all of the stuff that it is illuminating. It just because of how it's drawn, I don't think it would. But I didn't want to have just another bit of solid black back there. I think it would have made it feel really, really empty. So ultimately I went in and was like, we'll put like a skull thing in there with bleeding eyes. That'll make it interesting. So yeah, noodling in just the sort of black parts. I will say that also, the nice thing about having sort of mist effect or anything, like if you look at the main baddie or Lich or whatever, I've put in, obviously sort of the eyes and nose. Interestingly, those are the same sort of shadows you get off of a person's face. If they're heavily obscured, like if you take an image of somebody and then really sort of blur it, like heavily blur it, and then kind of white it out, you'll notice that the eye socket creates a shadow, the nose creates a pretty big shadow. The mouth doesn't as much, just because it's just a seam on the face. But and I've seen this effect used to some effect in film as well. But the face does kind of look like a skull in certain circumstances when it's heavily obscured. So in this case, maybe he has a skull for a head. Maybe it's his actual head. Can't really tell. Just because it's obscured, but I felt like that really kind of added to the mystery of it. So now I'm actually putting in some of this background stuff, to just kind of fill it out. And I wanted to have the smoke trails off of the those torches be sort of an interesting piece. I wanted it to add something to that sort of upper portion, which was feeling kind of empty with just like those vines up there. And so I kind of added them as a bit of a design element. It is something that I think I've seen Magnola do before. I know I've done it on another piece before. I like it. It does create something. I don't know if it's I don't know why it's pleasing to me to have like that sort of smoke thing, but I do enjoy just sort of having them in there. Sorry about that. Had to cough. Um, but it also, because I can color it, I knew that in the final piece it was going to create a little bit more life to that sort of section. Because ultimately in the back, I put down a slate color for the background and then added all my light and everything on top of it, which we'll see here in a little bit. And I knew that I wanted a little bit more warm color seeping into the top, and so the smoke trails that I added there are kind of for that. So yeah, that wobbling around again is me just sort of checking over the piece. I don't zoom in and zoom out a lot. And this is where I decided to add this other vine because that one side was looking sort of too light. It was, it's not as heavy. Large black spaces create sort of a weight to the eye. And so this is where I'm adding a new layer and then realizing, I can't erase on the right layer. So that's kind of the downside to having multiple layers. So I was like, I'll add another vine. But the problem is that those mushrooms that are there are just generating a ton of light, or at least the goal I knew was going to be for them to kind of lighten up that side so that you could see the wall scrawlings and things. And so I was like, well, I'll add this vine. So, and here's kind of where I think I messed up a little bit. When you're doing some design, and this was really just, I kind of knew it at the time, but decided to go with it, and I think it kind of failed me. But you have to think about kind of where the eye is going to travel, and what you're looking at. So, when I look at this piece, the first thing I probably see is sort of the background of the skull, and then my eye kind of moves around that area. The problem is that eventually my eye is going to land on that vine, and that vine on the left there sort of just scrolls the eye off the piece, off the page, whereas everything else is sort of center oriented, which is where I want the eye to go. Arguably you could say that, well, if you're not really looking at the piece and your eye comes in, then maybe it leads you down to the hero. The hero's looking at the lich is kind of pointing down, maybe, but I think ultimately it just wasn't so great. It wasn't a great decision on my part. Probably needed to make it thicker or more interesting or something. So here I am actually starting to throw in lights. I threw down a sort of gray-blue background, and then I'm going through and manually adding just little point lights. I will say that, in terms of fire, technically these are backwards, and that was kind of intentional. So fire is sort of white-yellow at the middle, and then it goes to orange, and then red sort of at the tips. In this case, these are actually backwards, so the yellow is the largest part, and then it goes sort of orange, and then sort of red at the center. Again, it was sort of a feeling of things being wrong that I wanted to convey. So, it wasn't necessarily a mistake. Did it pan out? I don't know. Maybe people think that the color choice is wrong, but I kind of ultimately liked it. I think it still feels pretty good. And the nice thing with this particular style is, you do have to be conscious of the colors, but you don't have to be super nitpicky about it. If you look at a lot of Magnola stuff, I think he uses like a watercolor or something. And I'm not even sure if he does his own color work. I'm sure he has, but you can get away with doing some just real flat looking colors without having to do a ton of shading and things. So here I'm using basically it's an oil brush. It's one of their oil brushes, just color in sections. I mean, really, I could use anything. The reason I like it is because, if I miss a spot or something, it allows you to sort of push color around, so you can add some color variation. You'll see I made some changes too. I had to go back in and fix a whole bunch of like little areas that I missed. I know that it probably would have been easier to use some sort of selection tool to do a lot of this, but what can I say? I'm old school. You can see already I have a ton of layers for different colors. It's like the mushroom light has its own layer, all the torch lights have their own layer, that cloud has its own layer. You also notice that as I was going through and doing the cloud, I would pick progressively darker but more saturated colors. That is typically how you want to do something that is more enshrouded. So the darker or more, in darkness something is. Yeah, see, I missed all this stuff and I had to go back and clean it up, which you probably can't see if you're zoomed out, but I knew that, if anybody was going to take a close look at this, I wanted to not be terrible. But yeah, as things go back in space, they become darker and more saturated. Typically, they also tend to go more blue as they go. And again, I'm not a great colorist. I don't paint a lot. But I will say that it has helped me a lot to just kind of get better at understanding what colors I should be picking, by kind of keeping that in mind. Things get more saturated, more black, sort of, and more black as they descend into the background. In darkness, it doesn't work quite the same way when stuff's in light. Like if you're outside, then things tend to get more blue-gray. And it's sort of whatever the sort of sky color is, that base sky color, is sort of, they advance more towards whatever that medium is, especially when you're using large spaces. If you're using just like, you're doing a character drawing, that character happens to be outside, you can kind of stick with the more saturated, more dark, depending upon how much light there is in the space. So yeah, just continuing to sort of knock in color. Now I'm finally sort of adding those trails, and I sort of knew what I wanted them to look like. There are still some weird issues I ran into, and I think it's just because I didn't draw it quite on the same layer, like all the colors. And so if you look really closely at the torches, you can kind of see where the smoke intersects with the little light bubble. Ultimately, I did go in and add some yellow to the torch core itself, but just not the stuff around it. Oh yeah, the other nice thing about the gradient is you can see that it basically, as soon as I put the gradient on those torches, or on the torch that's on the floor near the skulls instantly read like 1,000% better. Like they suddenly look like they're a lit up pile. They look really good. And then this is just throwing in the vine color, which is a sort of like sickly green. Another thing that I would point out with Mignola's stuff is that, and I'm sorry to keep bringing him up, he's just a really great example of this style. Is that there's a lot of, like, things look very gray, and that's another good sort of thing for gloom, because when you add color really livens things up. It makes things look alive. It makes things look, interesting and beautiful. And so if you want to sort of draw that back and have a little bit more, something that feels more statuesque, then I would say it's a good idea to sort of desaturate, keep your colors more on gray. And I'm trying to think the best way to say it, with a lot of this, the more gray you can get your colors, it does make it feel sort of inevitable, like stone. And I feel like that's a really good sort of tone to set when you're trying to do something that is, gloom. Which I would definitely say that this kind of piece and a lot of this kind of work is sort of just gloomy. It just feels kind of oppressive and dark and heavy. And so some of that comes from the black, but also the color choice. I mean, I could have done a really vibrant red for the torch color, but instead they look kind of wan. Like it looks like it's been printed on bad paper. Like it looks really sucked out. And the reason for that is I really just wanted that. This was also a chance the brush I'm on now is they have a running watercolor brush in Clip Studio, which I found is actually really good for just quick blending. Oil brushes, the way that they work in this program, and I'm sure there's ways I could set it up differently, but they really only pull color from whatever layer you're on. So if I have, dark green and I put yellow on top of it on the layer above, the yellow is just going to come out yellow. I have to actually be painting on that green to get it to work. But that running watercolor, because it has like a transparency to it, creates some nice, interesting fuzzy edges that aren't just like an airbrush where it's just super soft and it looks very digital. So instead, it kind of creates this nice little watery looking thing, which worked well for fog. So kind of what I ended up doing. This is the lichen that I'm kind of drawing in. I'm not even sure if it's lichen really. I felt like it was just a textured piece of stone or something a little bit different, but I wanted to give it a different color so it had a bit more interest and didn't just look like anything else. This is something that right now I'm throwing in that color in other places to kind of make additional shadow, to give it like an additional layer of shadow, I guess I should say. I don't know if it was entirely necessary. I think it adds a little bit. It's not super impactful, but it does add something to it. Yeah, and so here I'm adding in the color, and then at one point, I don't know if you saw, it was pretty, yeah, there it is, where I'm like, oh yeah, no, that color is way too bright. Looks too pink, gotta get rid of it. And that sort of spine piece up in the corner is supposed to be sort of like, something that maybe you don't see at first, and then after looking at the piece for a little bit, you're like, is that a spine? Ooh, that's gross. What is that on it? And that was kind of the goal, is to be, oh, there's something up in the corner. Oh, there's something up in the corner. And that's kind of how I wanted it, the viewer to sort of enter, or at least when they finally see that spot, to be like, oh, ooh, no, not good. Some more vines. I'll be honest, I don't really know why. I like the vines as an element because they do allow me to do those creepy spirals. But other than that, like, I can't tell you I have a specific reason for them being there. Again, this was mostly just kind of to be an environment piece with something kind of crazy going on. And so I added vines just to help provide that element. And then here, fixing the mushrooms so that they look like they're actually casting light, and doing some highlights. With highlights, and it was partly because that vine was looking really, really flat, and it looked like a lot of things. It was hard to tell where that light source actually was, like if it was the mushrooms or if it was something else. And so I added some highlights to make it pretty clear that that is exactly what that was. Well, this is about to wrap up, so I hope you all enjoyed this. Hope you learned something. But until next time, I'll probably keep making these at least for a little while to see kind of what the interest is out there. But this came out of a bad drawing day. So even if you're having a bad day drawing, just keep at it, and catch you guys next time.